Welcome to the Money Metals Midweek Memo, news and commentary relating to sound money, the precious metals markets, and the economy. I'm your host, Mike Maharrey. Thanks for tuning in. Well, the federal government is closed. At midnight, they flipped off the lights, locked up the doors, and went home. The feds, that is. Now, as people clutch their pearls over this government shutdown, I like to remind them that if the federal government limited itself to the things that it was constitutionally authorized to do, you wouldn't even notice. It's true. Also, Uncle Sam wouldn't have $37 trillion in debt hanging around his neck. Now, if you think I'm nuts, if you doubt me, just go grab a copy of the Federalist Papers or look them up online and read Federalist number 45. In that essay, James Madison describes what the American political system was supposed to look like under the Constitution. Now, keep in mind, this was Madison trying to sell the public on the new Constitution. And he insisted that under the proposed Constitution, the powers delegated to the federal government would be few and defined. And he said those which would remain to the state governments would be numerous and indefinite. And he went on to explain that those foreign powers, or those federal powers, would primarily be related to, quote, external objects as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, with which last the power of taxation will, for the most part, be connected. Madison went on and he wrote, the powers reserved to the several states will extend to all objects which in the ordinary course of affairs concerns the lives, liberties, and properties of the people and the internal order and improvement and prosperity of the states. He said the operations of the federal government will be most extensive and important in times of war and danger, those of the state governments in times of peace and security. Now think about that. The state governments are supposed to be doing all of the things which in the ordinary course of affairs concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people. That's things like education, healthcare, police. The federal government shouldn't have its fingers in any of that stuff. Now, what Madison described in Federalist 45, does this sound remotely like the system as it operates today? Now, of course, that's a rhetorical question. Of course it doesn't. In fact, the entire system is flipped on its head. We have a system in which the powers of the federal government are numerous and indefinite, and the states have basically just been relegated to, administrative centers or something. And it's interesting because if we go back and we look at the ratification debates for the Constitution, one of the biggest fears in the founding era was a consolidated government with all of the power centered in Washington, D.C. The people who opposed the Constitution, the anti-federalists, they argued that the Constitution would lead to consolidation. That's why they opposed it. Supporters of the Constitution, like Madison, swore it wouldn't. Nobody argued that consolidation was a good idea or the plan. Thomas Jefferson, he summed it up really well. He said, what has destroyed liberty and the rights of man in every government which has ever existed under the sun? The generalizing and concentrating all cares and powers into one body. Kind of like what we have today. George Mason said a consolidated government is totally subversive of every principle which hitherto has governed us. And he warned that this power is calculated to annihilate totally the state governments. It's almost like these guys were prophets because this is exactly what we've got. We've got a massive federal government in Washington, D.C. that basically controls virtually every aspect of our life. Think about it. The federal government determines how much water is in your toilet and what kind of light bulbs you can screw into your fixtures. Now, does that sound like a federal government with powers that are few and defined? No, it does not. We have consolidation. But you know what? It is what it is. I just felt compelled to share a little bit of political theory that's suitable to this moment because the founders envisioned what we have today. And it's not a good thing, but I guess it's the world we have to live in. It's what we have to deal with. So for folks who might not know, I've actually written a book about the Constitution. It's called Constitution Owner's Manual. And it goes over all of the various clauses in the Constitution and what they meant according to the explanation of the founding generation during the ratification debates. So things like Commerce Clause. What does commerce mean? What is general welfare? What is necessary and proper? You can actually find that book on Amazon if you just Google Constitution Owner, or not Google, but search Constitution Owner's Manual and my name, and it'll pop up. So buy one of my books. Shameless plug there. But anyway, what is this government shutdown that we are now in the midst of all about? Well, I'm going to give you an overview, but first I want to take a quick moment and thank you for listening to the show, because I know there's a lot of stuff out there to listen to, and it means a lot to me that you spend a little bit of time every week with me. So thank you for that. Now, if you want to help the show out, I'm not going to charge you anything to listen, but you could really help out by just going to wherever you listen, whether it's, Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever, and write us a review. Give us a good, strong review. Give us those 5 stars and share these episodes. If you like what you're hearing, share them on your social media platforms. It'll help grow the show and help expand it, and I think ultimately make it a better show. So anyway, thank you so much again for listening. I also wanted to note before I get into the government shutdown stuff, silver got really close to $48 an ounce the other day. It gave up a little bit yesterday, but it's back up today. It's over 47. I think it's knocking on the door of 47.50. Now we're talking about a couple of bucks from the all-time high, which was $50 an ounce. And here's the thing, silver still looks to have plenty of room to run higher. The gold-silver ratio is still over 80-1. And in a nutshell, that just means that silver is underpriced compared to gold. And then there's the supply and demand dynamics. We have very tight supply. We have a lot of demand, especially in the industrial sector right now. Investment demand is picking up. So we have those dynamics. I've talked about that on the show before. And, a lot of people I talk to, technical analysts and whatnot, they say that once silver hits that record of $50, it's going to break out even higher very quickly. So what I'm getting at is it's probably not too late to get in on the silver rally. Now, you might be thinking, well, what's the best way to get silver right now? Let me suggest junk silver. And no, it's not really junk. What I'm talking about are pre-1965 quarters, dimes, and half dollars. These coins, if you have a quarter or a dime or a half dollar that was minted in 1964 or earlier, they are 90% silver. In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson signed an order that removed all of the silver from the money. It was basically a massive, depreciation of our money. And just to kind of give you an idea of how much it's depreciated. If you take one of those quarters and you go to a store, it's worth 25 cents, right? Nobody's going to give you the value of the silver. But if you actually take one of these silver dimes or quarters or half dollars and melt them down, you end up with a lot more value than what is printed on the face. For instance, that 1964 quarter is worth over $8 right now. So it's a great way to get silver. And here's the thing. The premiums on junk silver right now are some of the lowest we've seen in a long time. As low as 49 cents per troy ounce for junk silver dimes and or quarters. It's a little bit more for half dollars. But to give you a comparison, back in 2023, premiums for junk silver got as high as $15 over spot. So it's a great time to get junk silver. I like to hold a little bit of junk silver because if there were any type of economic crisis, the power grid goes down, these silver quarters, dimes, and nickels would be fantastic for barter. And so you're preserving your wealth with silver, and you also have, kind of an emergency fund that could be used if there was a period where, you couldn't get to the bank or whatever. So check that out. We do sell junk silver over at moneymetals.com. Just go to moneymetals.com and search for it, and you will find it right there. Or you can talk to a Money Metals precious metals specialist if you have questions or need more information. So we have a government shutdown. Now, we've had a couple of shutdown scares, but I think this is the first really significant closure since Barack Obama was in the White House. Now, I think there was a a very short shutdown, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. But the one I really remember was back when Obama was president. And, based on what happened back then, calling this a shutdown is a little bit of an overstatement. I mean, all of the worst things that the government does is going to continue. The war machine is going to keep warring, right? The surveillance state will keep right on spying. The IRS is not going to stop collecting taxes. So, they'll keep extorting. So, most of the things that are most pernicious about government, they're going to keep on going. What we have is political theater. That's what a government shutdown really is. They're meant to inflict maximum pain and inconvenience on ordinary people. And the goal is to make you angry at the other team so that you will vote accordingly. So we're going to have dueling finger pointings, right? Republicans are going to blame Democrats. Democrats are going to blame Republicans. I don't even care to get into the politics of the thing. Just know that this theater is for your benefit. It's to motivate and move you by your emotions. I remember when the government shut down during the Obama administration, one of the more ludicrous moves was closing Mount Rushmore. Yes, the federal government closed outside. And this is just kind of one example of some of the ludicrous things that they did. People trying to access federal websites during that lockdown encountered a message. Due to the lapse in federal government funding, this website is not available. Now, I don't know if they've done that yet. I haven't looked at any federal government websites. You might go look, see if the website is closed because, it cost a lot of money to keep that website accessible. In fact, I bet it costs more to put up that message than it would have been just to leave the website as is. Don't update it, just leave it accessible. But no, we're going to block it because we're going to show you we're closed, right? Back in 2011, the feds blocked World War II veterans from entering an outdoor memorial that was paid for and maintained with private funds. They even kicked people out of their own homes. There was an article on a Nevada TV station that talked about a family that lived within the bounds of a federal park, and they were told they had to leave their house. This was around Lake Mead, and according to this Nevada TV station, Joyce Spencer, she was 77 years old at the time, her husband was 80, quote, "They've been spending most of their time in the family ice cream store since going home isn't an option." The Spencers never expected to be forced out of their Lake Mead home, which they've owned since the 70s, but on Thursday, a park ranger said they had 24 hours to get out. Now, there's absolutely no logical reason that this order existed. There's no reason these people couldn't stay in their house because the federal government is closed, right? It doesn't cost the feds any money for an old couple to live in their house. This was nothing more than a move designed to inflict pain on innocent people to make a political point. Now, who does this? Well, bullies. People with power who care about nothing other than exercising, maintaining, and increasing that power. So take all of this for what it is. And don't get caught up in the political theater, right? Watch what Congress actually does to get this stalemate resolved, because that's what's really important. This is just all a dog and pony show. And I can give you a hint about what is going to happen when the final act of this play ends. There's going to be more spending, more borrowing, and more debt. Yes, I'm a little bit cynical about government shutdowns, if you haven't noticed. I mean, I'm a little cynical about government, let's be honest. But, where am I wrong, right? So what is this really all about? Well, the fiscal year ended yesterday, and there's no spending blueprint for fiscal 2026. Now, they had a whole year. It was not like 2026 just snuck up on them, right? It's not like, we didn't realize that the fiscal year was about to end. Of course not. They just can't get anything done, which shows you how dysfunctional this government is. So the House has passed a continuing resolution that would basically keep spending going at current levels until Congress can hammer out that 2026 budget. Now, realizing that they have some leverage because it requires 60 votes in the Senate to pass a continuing resolution, and the Republicans don't have 60 votes, Democrats, led by Senator Chuck Schumer, are demanding an extension of billions of dollars in Obamacare tax subsidies and other spending tweaks to the healthcare program. They want that to be included in the resolution. And that's because the tax care subsidies, these Obamacare tax subsidies, have vanished into thin air as of October 1st. And House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries said, "Our position has been very clear. Cancel the cuts, lower the cost, save health care." And Republicans called this a no-go. Chuck Schumer, this is a quote from House Speaker Mike Johnson. He said, Chuck Schumer came back with a long laundry list of partisan demands that didn't fit into this process, and he's going to try to shut the government down. Okay, so that's basically what the debate is about. And we could sit here and argue all day about who's right or wrong. The Republicans are spinning this as health care for illegal aliens, which I don't know if that's altogether accurate because, quite frankly, as a self-employed person, I have to go through the Obamacare exchange and I get tax credits. Pretty much everybody, 90% of the people that get health insurance through the Obamacare system have health tax credits because it's so stupidly expensive. Even with my tax credits, it's stupidly expensive. So it's not just necessarily about illegals, but that's the political spin. And, again, this isn't really about spending. It's about politics. It's about sound bites. It's about power. The spending's coming down the pike regardless. That's what I'm driving at here. And I can say this with complete confidence because spending always increases. So the bill that's at odds, and the Senate did ultimately vote this down. It was the Continuing Appropriations and Extension Act of 2026. So it's basically just a stopgap, right? We keep the government open until November 21st, basically give Congress a couple of months to hammer out the fiscal 2026 appropriations, which, that's going to be a what too. But anyway, that's where you're going to see the spending is when they actually come up with the 2026 budget. Now, as it was drawn up, the continuing resolution wasn't going to increase spending significantly. It would have kept federal agencies funded at roughly current fiscal year 2025 rates. However, there were a few spending increases in this Republican CR. It included added security for federal officials, higher operating rates for some specific accounts, including the Treasury's terrorism and financial intelligence account, and it also boosted spending on some SBA guarantee programs. Why were those in there? Politics. But even this quote-unquote clean continuing resolution had spending increases in it because, again, Congress can't resist the temptation to spend more money. So based on the Congressional Budget Office analysis, the CR would implement a handful of narrow spending increases for specific needs while mandatory programs keep running on autopilot. So again, the House passed that resolution, but the roadblock was in the Senate. So enter the government shutdown. And nobody at this point seems inclined to budge. Now, of course they will. I mean, you can't leave the federal government shut down forever. But this isn't really about actually hammering out a sane spending plan, right? It's about politics. I've said that several times, but that's the reality. It's about making you mad, and it's about showing up the other side. And when it's all said and done, they'll come to some sort of compromise, which will ultimately involve spending more money that the federal government doesn't have. Now, even if it doesn't increase spending, keep in mind that holding spending at current levels isn't exactly good news. Current levels means that they're spending money hand over fist, right? With 1 month left in fiscal 2025, the federal government had already spent $6.73 trillion. That was a 5.9% increase over the same period in fiscal 2024. So, shocking, the federal government spent more this year already than it did all of last year. There is no indication that spending is going to slow down anytime soon. Remember, we had the big, beautiful bill. This is supplemental spending. It cut some spending, but it increased it in other areas. Furthermore, those cuts were from projected spending increases. So what they do is, let's say that the budget says that spending for ABC program is going to go up 10% next year. And then the Congress comes along and says, oh, we're only going to raise spending on that program 5% instead of 10%. They will call that a 5% spending cut, even though they're spending 5% more than they did the year before. That's called baseline budgeting. And any time that you see a cut, it's almost always not really a cut. It's almost always a decrease in the increase of spending, right? So the bottom line is that even with the big, beautiful bill, spending's going to increase on an absolute basis. And this is par for the course. Make no mistake, the 2026 spending bill will increase. We will spend more money next year than we did this year. I mean, they may trim the speed of some of those spending increases, and again, they're going to call it a cut, and partisans will cheer, but spending's going to increase on an absolute level. It always does. I would bet significant amounts of money on this. The fact of the matter is, it's easy to make this a partisan thing. So, Trump doesn't care, or, it's Obama's fault, or it's Biden's fault. Every president since Calvin Coolidge has left the U.S. with a bigger national debt than when he took office. Every single one. That includes Bill Clinton, who actually ran some budget surpluses for a couple of years. But even he left office with the U.S. in more debt than when he came in. The ugly truth is the government isn't committed to cutting spending in any meaningful way. And it always finds new reasons to spend even more, whether there's a crisis at home or a war overseas or whatever. You all know this, right? So what does this really mean? What's it mean for you? Well, it means more money printing, which is more inflation, because that's the only way that the federal government can sustain this level of borrowing and spending. I often say that the Federal Reserve is the engine that drives the biggest government in the history of the world. Now, we could argue about whether maybe there was some government at some point that was bigger. I kind of tried to research this. It's hard to compare, different eras and whatnot, but the U.S. government, believe me, as far as spending, as far as its world power, it's one of the biggest ever. Maybe Rome was bigger. It's debatable. What's not debatable is the government couldn't have gotten this big and powerful if the central bank didn't engage in policies that support the borrowing and spending, right? The Fed puts its big fat thumb on the treasury market by keeping interest rates artificially lower than they otherwise would be. And in extreme situations such as the pandemic, the Great Recessions, the central bank buys treasuries and holds them on its balance sheet. So it basically creates artificial demand for U.S. debt. It does this with money created out of thin air. And this allows Uncle Sam to borrow more than it otherwise could at a lower interest rate. That's one of the biggest things, one of the biggest roles of the Federal Reserve. It's to support the borrowing and spending. It's why the federal government is no longer on a gold standard. It's why Roosevelt started severing the dollar from gold. It's why Nixon made that final cut in 1971, because a gold standard will not allow the Federal Reserve to expand the money supply as fast as it needs to in order to support all of the borrowing and spending. Now, this all leads to price inflation, right? This is why your paycheck buys less and less every single month. And by the way, this ability to control the borrowing is starting to break down. With interest rates higher, the U.S. government is now spending $1 trillion a year just to keep up with interest payments on the debt. Interest expense is the second largest spending category in the federal budget. It's more than national defense. It's even more than Medicaid. There's only one spending category that's higher, and that's Social Security. Meanwhile, a lot of people are becoming wary of buying U.S. treasuries. We're seeing treasury holdings shrink, especially foreign treasury holdings. They have lost their safe haven appeal because nobody wants to lend their drunk uncle more money when all of his credit cards are already maxed out. So this is why I keep saying that no matter what they tell you, inflation isn't under control. It can't be under control because inflation is the plan. It is necessary for this massive big government that's shut down, right? The reality is they just want to keep inflation at a level where you don't notice it or get too angry. That's the plan. The plan, the stated goal is to keep inflation, price inflation at 2%. That's 5% or 10% every 5 years. So every 5 years, your dollar loses 10% of its value. This relentless devaluation of your dollar is exactly why you want to have real money. It's why you want to have gold and silver, right? The government can't print gold and silver. It can't print their value away. Most people define inflation as rising consumer prices. And I've talked about this before on the show. In fact, I've done a whole show on the actual real definition of inflation and how that's been changed over the years. But today, the CPI is the main inflation metric. And what does the CPI measure? It measures consumer prices. It's a basket of goods, and they measure how much the price of that basket of goods fluctuates. So when that basket of goods is going up, well, then we say we have a lot of inflation. If it's going down, there's no inflation. Now, of course, it should be obvious how problematic this is just on the surface because, of course, it depends on, what they include in the basket and what weight they give to each part of that basket. So it is a number that is easily manipulated by changing the equation. And in fact, that's exactly what they did back in the 1990s. After the 1970s, we had all of that inflation and it was an inflationary crisis and then we had stagflation. So in the 90s, somebody, some brainchild somewhere decided, oh, well, you know what? I think this CPI is overstating inflation. So they reworked the equation. The formula that they use today makes CPI about half of what it would be using the old formula that was in the 1970s. So if you're getting, 3% CPI today, if you run those exact same numbers through the old formula in the 70s, it would be closer to 6%. But what I'm really driving at here is that the CPI is just a metric that measures one type of inflation, price inflation. It does not measure monetary inflation, which I would call real inflation. So like if you go back in the day, back in the 70s, the 80s, if you said inflation to an economist, they would understand that you were talking about an increase in the supply of money and credit. And one symptom of this is rising consumer prices. But inflation also manifests in other ways. For instance, we can see it in asset inflation. Now, keep in mind that inflation properly defined, as I just said, isn't about prices, right? It's an increase in the supply of money and credit. That was the technical economic definition. They've changed that over the years to make you think that it's just about rising prices because, we can blame rising prices on all kinds of things, right? Greedy corporations, we've heard, or Putin's price hikes, or, I don't know, voodoo. They'll say, oh, we don't understand why prices are going up. There is only one reason, though, that the supply of money and credit go up, and that's because of government actions. So it's easy to point the finger and blame if we define inflation properly, which gives you a little hint at probably why they've redefined it. But the key thing to understand here is that rising consumer prices are just a symptom of monetary inflation. And they can manifest in other ways. It's exactly what happened after the 2008 financial crisis, right? After the 2008 financial crisis, we went into the Great Recession. The Federal Reserve slashed interest rates to zero, and it launched quantitative easing for the first time. Now, when that happened, a lot of people, particularly conservatives, a lot of economists said that there's going to be this huge spike in consumer prices because that's kind of the understanding. When you have an increase in the money supply, when you have increased government spending, it drives consumer prices up, and that's inflationary, right? That never happened. In fact, during the decade after the 2008 financial crisis, the CPI remained relatively tame. And this led some Keynesian economists, notably Paul Krugman, to declare that, money printing is harmless, right? However, the monetary inflation that was created during the Great Recession did manifest, right? It didn't just disappear into thin air. It just didn't manifest in consumer prices. It fed a major surge in asset prices that was clearly visible in the stock market. It wasn't just the stock market. You could see it in real estate. We had an art bubble for a while in the mid-O's. So that's where all of this new money went. It went into the banking system and it kind of stayed in the financial system. It didn't dribble out into the broader economy. Now, during the pandemic, it was a completely different scenario because as the federal government was printing all of this money, it was also handing out stimulus checks to people who weren't producing anything. And so we had the increase in the money supply and a decrease in demand. So that drove prices higher. Very predictable. But it didn't quite play out that same way in 2008. We saw the primary impacts of monetary inflation in asset prices. So looking at the S&P 500, it rose by over 130% between 2010 and 2019. 130%. It got into bubble territory. In fact, if you remember, if you have a good long memory, you'll remember in the fall of 2018, we had a stock market shakeup, a pretty big sell-off. And when that happened, the Fed pivoted. It stopped trying to raise interest rates. It went back to rate cuts, and it actually started implementing some, they wouldn't call it this, but it was quantitative easing, and this was before the pandemic. I have often said that the pandemic saved the federal government and the Federal Reserve's bacon. It allowed them to go on an extreme monetary policy binge, right, where it injected nearly $5 trillion into the economy through quantitative easing alone during the pandemic. That kind of kept that bubble that was blown up after the Great Recession. It kept it alive. It kept the air in the bubble. They kind of used that crisis as an excuse. Now, they would never tell you this, but that's exactly what happened. So just remember, what I'm driving at here is that inflation is much more ubiquitous than you might think. It's not just at the grocery store. It's also on Wall Street. And we can see this inflationary pressure on the gold, on the stock market even more clearly if we price the Dow Jones in gold, right? At its peak in 1929, before Black Monday, the Dow was 381.17. The price of gold at that time was $20 an ounce. So if you price the Dow in gold, the Dow was around 19 ounces. It took 19 ounces of gold to, quote unquote, buy the Dow Jones. Now, today, the Dow is just over 46,300. I looked that up yesterday. Could be up or down, but it's in that 46,000 ballpark. Meanwhile, gold is around $3,800 an ounce. That means priced in gold, the Dow is now just over 12 ounces. It would only take 12 ounces of gold to buy the Dow, quote unquote, whereas it took 19 ounces back in 1921. That's a 37% decline in the Dow in gold terms over the last 96 years. So all of these gains that people talk about in the stock market, all inflation. Since gold is real stable money, pricing the Dow in the yellow metal reveals that the appreciation of the stock market over the last century was predominantly driven by inflation. True story. And, it's interesting because pricing things in gold really helps you see how the government is devaluing your money. I've used this example before. If you go back into the early 1900s, a fine suit cost just over an ounce of gold. And today, a fine suit costs just over an ounce of gold. So don't be fooled. Inflation is pernicious. Inflation is ever present. Inflation is the plan. They are devaluing your money every single day. We have a government shutdown now where ostensibly they're not spending a whole lot of money, but by golly, they're going to once they get this resolved. This is the way of the world. So, I've told people recently, and this is something that's kind of been percolating in my brain. We can't vote this away, right? This is not something that we can solve politically. Just look at what's going on in Congress right now. There's no solving going on. It's all about exercising and obtaining power. That's what politics is about. They don't care about fixing anything. They will kick the can down the road as far as they can. As long as they have road, they're going to keep can kicking because all they're really worried about is getting elected in the next cycle. What happens 5-10 years from now, we'll just worry about that when we get there. So there's not a political solution here. You're not going to vote this problem away. All you can do is try to shield yourself from the impacts of it, to try to make yourself as solid and protect your wealth as best you can. And one way to do that is to have real money, right? You don't want to save in dollars that are constantly being devalued. You want to save in real money, gold and silver, that will retain their value over time, even as the government devalues fiat money. So this is why I say every week, call Money Metals. Get that real money. Get gold and silver. Just call 800-800-1865. Talk to a Money Metals precious metals specialist. If you have questions, you want to know how to get into precious metals, what are the types of items that you might want to consider buying. These folks are fantastic. They'll answer your questions. They're very patient. Even if you're asking questions that you might think, well, this might be a dumb question. No, go ahead and ask them. That's why they're there. And, I know some people don't really like to talk on the phone. That's cool. You can go to moneymetals.com. You can chat with the precious metals specialist right there in a chat. so you don't have to actually talk on the phone. Or, if you know what you want to get some of that junk silver that I talked about earlier in the show, you can go to moneymetals.com. You can find those items. You can order online. We'll ship them out to you, or we can store your metals in our state-of-the-art vault, which I got to see a couple weeks ago, and it's pretty awesome. I talked about it in last week's show if you didn't hear that. So do that today. 800-800-1865. Get real money. Don't think that there's a political solution. Shield yourself, protect yourself, prepare yourself. So that is a wrap for this episode of the Money Metals Midweek Memo, where we are open. You can get more information about everything that I've talked about on the show today and a lot more over at moneymetals.com/news, and that website is up. And if you want to get the latest news and information relating to gold and silver right in your inbox, make sure you sign up and get on our email list. Of course, you could subscribe to the Midweek Memo on your favorite podcasting platform. And when you do, you can also tune into our Market Wrap podcast, which airs every Friday, where you're going to get a quick overview of the week in precious metals, along with conversations between yours truly and interesting people from the world of gold, silver, economics, and investing. This week, I'm going to be talking to economist Daniel Lacal. So do all of that. Thanks again for listening to the show. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your week. Again, please like and share the episodes. It helps us out. And again, have a great week and enjoy your government shutdown.